You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor of its EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And joining me as usual is ITK Principal David Leach. David, I trust you are well.
Giles, I'm well. I'm still recovering from the rigours of reading the Nelson Review, as I'm sure many of our listeners studiously avoid doing.
Well, look, and may well do so. It's over 200 and something pages, and there's probably more to come. But we actually, to save people the effort of having to read it all, we've actually got the not just Tim Nelson, but the whole panel on board to discuss, to tell us, to take us through the highlights. So let's go straight to the interview with Tim Nelson, Paula Conboy, Ava Hancock, and Phil Hirschhorn. Tim Nelson, thank you. Well, welcome back to the Energy Insiders podcast, Tim.
Thanks for having us.
And I'd also like to welcome the other members of your panel, Paula Conboy, Ava Hancock, and Phil Hirschhorn. Look, thank you very much. Very landmark event, I think, the release of your draft conclusions or your draft recommendations on the Nelson Review. Tim, let's start off with you. I mean, there's lots of really important recommendations here, a lot of it about transparency, a lot of it about involvement of CER and sort of household batteries and solar and electric vehicles. But I guess, as you describe it yourself in your report, the most significant part of it is this decision to sort of offer these new types of contract over bulk energy, shaping and firming. And these come under the sort of the rubric of the electricity security entry mechanism. But before we dive into that acronym, the basis of what you've done is that you've decided that the energy system or the energy market as it is can be improved, but it's not completely broken. So you're going to kind of keep it and tweak it. Where other people might have thought that you're just going to sort of chuck the baby out of the bathwater. Why did you choose to go this way?
I think the first thing that we did as a panel was sit down and I try to identify what are the problems that we're trying to solve. And I suspect that the first problem that we really identified was not that the market didn't work, but that the market signals were incomplete. And where they've been incomplete is that the physical world has changed. We've shifted away from the way we used to produce energy to utilizing a mix of firmed renewables, but the financial world didn't keep up with that. And so the nature of the NEM being a spot market where risk is effectively managed by financial markets hadn't kept pace. That would be our first observation of the problem. So an incomplete signal, not an absence of the signal. And then the other absence that we identified was what we've called the tenor gap, which is a pretty simple proposition, which is the spot market gives you very good operational signals. The derivative markets can give you some degree of ability to manage risk in that kind of 3 to 5 year time frame, but the investor time frame is much, much longer, and the signal is simply incomplete. It doesn't go that far into the future. So the package of reforms we've put forward aren't really fundamentally changing the market itself, but correcting for that incompleteness.
Because they were often described as being not fit for purpose, which sounded pretty damning and sort of sounded like you had to sort of rebuild it. But you've decided to move forward with the sort of this proposal. And I guess that, as I said before, the headline one is the Electricity Security Entry Mechanism, the ESEM. I guess, though, that the devil's going to be in the detail. I mean, you've kind of said no to capacity markets. Maybe you can sort of speak to that about why that was the case, or some people might argue this is another version of it. Maybe just we'll go into that and then just we'll think about, because the detail of this, it sounds like a really great idea, but it's going to come into sort of what people kind of agree to, the actual fine mechanics, isn't it?
Yeah, there's probably two things I'd say there. One is that what's on the table really does give you that long-term pricing signal for capacity, but it's effectively a hybrid centralized, decentralized version of what a capacity market is designed to do, which is to provide that signal. The second thing is you're absolutely right that the next level of detail becomes critically important for the package of proposed reforms and their success. And that's where what we've tried to do is to build into the existing architecture of the market bodies and the various other kind of frameworks that we've got in place that allows industry to co-convene some of those programs.
And look, I'm just going to hand over to David now because he no doubt has a bunch of questions. But what has been your sense of the reaction so far? Have people been disappointed, frustrated, accepting, keen to knock out, the fine details? And how long will that process take?
I think that the feedback that we've had so far has been fairly positive. The feedback acknowledges that what we've tried to do is to provide a package of reforms that all work together to correct the incomplete signals that I mentioned earlier. But I think that there's an acknowledgement now that we do need to do the hard work on what it looks like in practice. But by utilising the existing frameworks, piloting a process that would then work kind of continuously into the future, we think that the next couple of months is all about continuing that engagement, doing that heavy lifting so that by the end of the year, we've got a suite of more detailed reforms that could be implemented relatively quickly because we know the transition is happening at a rapid pace and therefore it's important the market kind of keep track with it.
It's Paula here. I think the other one too is we were very deliberate about the process that we undertook. This wasn't about putting out an issues list and then a consultation paper that was a big tome and waiting for weeks and weeks to get large loads of submissions back. We were very intentional about the iterative approach that we took in consultation, and we'll do that again in the second half of the year. It's really about having everybody and all stakeholders the ability to weigh into the process and weigh into our review so that at the end, everybody can buy into it as well.
So, Paula, I remember reading something you wrote when you were in charge of the AER saying you, more or less, not quite, but you had read thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of submissions for every regulatory review. I've read quite a few myself. You must have thought you were shot of that forever, and here you are reading a lot of submissions again.
Think I'm glutton for punishment, David. I think the other one too is that with the approach that we had took, the submissions were equally short as well and to the point, and we followed up with numerous amount of one-on-one meetings, on workshops, working with the associations, consumer groups. So it wasn't really about holding yourself up for a whole weekend and going through tombs and tombs of written submissions.
About the cost of capital and its various, what the right beta is. But let's not go there. Can I just ask maybe, did you feel that there was a consensus that emerged amongst the submissions, or was there a divergence, for instance, between like gentailers and I don't know, consumer groups or other parties? Do you think there was a general sort of view of the direction that the market should go in? Like there must have been some support for capacity markets from some people. There is when I read more widely.
Yeah, it's Ava here. So there was an overwhelming number of submissions that supported retaining the energy-only market that we have and not throwing that out the window and starting from scratch with a 10-year reform process. There were some people that disagreed with that, but most people did see the spot market as effective for providing those operational signals, and any wrinkles can be ironed out through the rule change process. The other aspect was that the vast majority of stakeholders did see the need for a long-term investment signal embedded in the market structure. Most people identified that over the last 15 or so years, we've had a significant number of what we've called complementary measures, things like the G-Gas scheme in New South Wales, the Queensland 13% gas target, the LRET, the CIS. These have all been complementary measures that have been trying to provide that investment signal and have done a lot of the heavy lifting. People said that we need to embed that investment signal in the market structure and design.
Except that you haven't really. In my opinion, what you've come up with is another intervention, at least speaking as a market purist. And I want to say that I do believe prices are a wonderful idea in theory, but the whole idea of business is to avoid being exposed to prices and reduce price risk. But I guess my question, I want to come back to this duration issue and just contrast a couple of things. We have three large gentailers in the market in Australia, in the national electricity market, in AGL, Origin and Energy Australia. Each of them bought a coal generator from a government, which has a very long duration. None of them have really signed up any new wind or solar contracts in the last 3 years. So I ask myself, and I would ask you, why is it that they were prepared to go long on coal generators and not on renewable energy stuff? Is it something about renewable energy, or is it something about vested interests, in your opinion? Is that really relevant to the price signal? Because I kind of think that the role of a large retailer is that they can contract long because the large mass of customers that they have ensures that they have a predictable volume going forward. So that's on the one hand. And then for another observation, I look at Texas, which also has an energy-only market and has installed something like 40 gigawatts of wind and solar between 2019 and 2025, and is still installing it at a fantastic rate. Why does the price signal work there, but not in our similar energy-only market? So these are kind of the things I'm thinking about.
There's probably it's Tim here, I should say. It's probably a few things that I'd probably comment on there, David. So, firstly, the panel's not really. It's not appropriate for the panel to consider individual business models and what businesses may choose to invest in. So we wouldn't obviously take a view on that, but we would note that one of the real benefits of the transition at the moment is the very significant change in technology that's enabling consumers to take control of their future. And that's disruption. And disruption can mean a good outcome for consumers longer term because you've got new technology, new ways of producing, new ways of consuming. So I wouldn't say that it is only a small group of retailers who are telling us that going long is very challenging in that environment. It's every investor, whether they be on the buy or the sell side. So we heard the same thing from some of the large industrials, that trying to reinvest in their own production plants to make them more energy efficient is challenging because of the fact that they need some degree of long-term certainty for that payback to come in. So I think that this tenor gap has always existed. And I think to Ava's earlier point, the panel's pivot in terms of a long-term investment signal is really just to bring what used to be done outside the market structure, so things like the RET, things like the SIS, the LTESA framework, GGAS, and just bring it inside for the first time. I think that tenor gap does continue to exist in a world where technology and business models continue to change. So, and I guess the only other thing I'd mention just in response to the way things have changed around the world, we've engaged a lot with policymakers from around the world. We've engaged with ERCOT, we've engaged with the UK, we've engaged with PJM, we've engaged through, with New Zealand. There's been an awful lot of meetings that we've had internationally, including the International Energy Agency. The interesting observation that we would make is that everyone around the world, irrespective of their market structure, their market design, is dealing with this issue, which we've kind of colloquially called the tenor gap. But it really does seem to manifest right across the world. And because market design is really about kind of that, most people think of it as, what's your short-term spot market look like? Do you have energy only? Do you have capacity? But the big barrier to long-term investment, in our view, continues to come back to this tenor gap issue.
Sure, But like I said, Texas has a very similar market design, and they don't seem to have that issue at all. And so that's just an observation. Equally, when the RET was in place, which just provided extra money to wind and solar developers, there wasn't a problem either. The problem really is, in my opinion, that the big gentailers just don't want to go there, and therefore the government is essentially having to step in with a new market mechanism to ensure that new supply is occurring. That's happening with the CIS, and now isn't it fair to say that you want to embody a different version of that into the longer term procurement, so that essentially the government is going to take on risk one way or another, because they are going to procure new investment by offering contracts once there's an indication. Well, let me just leave it there. They're going to procure investment, take on the longer term price risk, and then hopefully sell it back to the market in due course. Isn't that basically how it's supposed to work?
In a nutshell, what we're trying to do, sorry, I should have said it's Tim again. In a nutshell, what we're really trying to do here is to make sure that the derivative market speaks to the long-term investment signal. And many of your listeners will know that, if you look back at a lot of my academic work, they'd be forgiven for thinking Tim's always been very supportive of certificated schemes, and now all of a sudden Tim's kind of part of this panel that's put forward something that looks a little different to that. In the last 6 months, not only have we consulted with a lot of people, we've learned a lot. We've listened, and what we've heard goes to the heart of maybe one of the limitations, I guess, of some of the policies previously, that they were focused on one element of the transition. And so if we take the RET as a really good example, a wonderful policy for trying to create more investment in renewables. But as coal comes out of the system, we need more than just renewables. We need renewables, we need shaping, we need firming. But we also need to make sure that the policy introduces these new services in a manner that allows the risk in the medium term to be managed. And if I had to say that what's been the biggest thing that I've learned in the last 6 months, it's been that all around the world, people are really trying to work through this. How do you link the spot to the medium to the long term, so that as these new services come into the market, they're not coming in an adjacent way, they're coming into a way that seamlessly allows that integration of the new investment signal with the medium-term risk management function. And I think as a panel, we're very proud of the fact that the report does link these three timeframes together in a way that, in our view, will allow for enduring success.
Good, I suppose. Let me, another thing that leads me to think that the fundamental diagnosis is the oligopolistic structure of the market as opposed to something else, is that a lot of the reforms, which I think everyone is going to support, involve better disclosure and stuff like that, and better ability of behind-the-meter resources. And I think you talk about demand response a lot. I personally don't hold out that much hope for that in 5-minute spot pricing intervals. But, I mean, I guess my issue is, what impact do you expect all of these better disclosures of the idea that you'll have market makers in standard derivative contracts? Or I might say market makers are going out of fashion in stock exchanges. What impact do you think that will have overall on the market?
Yeah, David, it's Phil Hirschhorn here. I think the way I think about this is that the derivative market provides that translation from the spot market to the longer term. And that only works if it's transparent and accessible. And so the point here around the market making obligation is to ensure that there is a visible, transparent, competitive price signal for the medium term. And so, we can't have a situation where the liquidity of those derivative products dries up. I think we've seen that in South Australia in the baseload swap contract. So we need to find those contracts that can be traded, make them traded, make the price visible, because that provides the translation from the spot to the medium term. And where that goes is that if you can see prices transparently for the medium term, that allows customers to contract in a way that gives them medium-term price stability.
And you don't think the future's to my mind, everyone knows that in South Australia there's no liquidity because there's one gentailer over there that's been running the market since before renewables were a thing. But let's put that all together to one side. I mean, we have the futures market that provides a price signal at the moment. You don't think that's an adequate signal?
I think there are a couple of aspects. So the contracts need to change to evolve with the physics. So, a baseload swap, what are the natural sellers of those baseload swaps? Are the coal-fired power stations. As they close, the natural issuers of those contracts cease to exist. And so what's the contract that can be provided by the new forms of generation, the renewables and so on? And so there's an element there. You'll see one of our recommendations is a process around deciding what those future contracts are. We want that to happen in advance of the coal-fired generators exiting so that liquidity can exist in the right set of products that match the physics going forward.
And would it also be fair to say, I mean, we mentioned that there's going to be bulk energy contracts, and in my mind, it's going to be very hard to have a contract that suits both wind and solar and will require the issuer of these new longer-term energy contracts to essentially have more of a planning function as regards to the quantity to be offered and whatever. So we are going to get more planning in the system one way or another, and I think the CIS already does that. But when we come... Go on, sorry, you want to say something?
Sorry, David. It's Tim here. The couple of key design features of kind of the mechanism that we put forward as part of the draft recommendations. The first is that we think that because projects would be finding customers in market for the observable first few years of their project life, to some extent, the market leads what mix of bulk energy comes into the system, because to Phil's point earlier around the transparency of pricing, once you've got some transparent pricing for these products, you'll start to see the market kind of gravitate towards the most efficient outcome. That's our view as a panel. Transparency and liquidity equals greater levels of market efficiency. That's our thinking. So that front end being exposed, or kind of not exposed is kind of not the right word, but finding customers within the market, we think is a really clever way of allowing the market to determine what the right mix of technologies looks like in the future. Now, to your point around what that contract might look like, that's why we think it's so important that it's an industry process where buyers and sellers come together to define that. We as a panel sat down and thought, what are the risks that it's unfair to ask a long-term, heavy fixed cost infrastructure investor to bear? And there are really two risks that we think if we were on their investment committee, we'd be kind of thinking, I'm not so sure about these risks. One's demand risk. Is demand going to be much higher? Is it going to be much lower? That's very, very challenging to establish over, say, the next 15 years, just given the nature of technology evolution. And that is the second risk, which is technology evolution.
But Tim, can I just point out, I kind of agree with demand risk, but I mean, every business always faces that and doesn't necessarily have a government scheme. But more to the point, we can all say with virtually 100% certainty that the coal generators are going away at some point in time, meaningfully close in the future, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or even 15 years. We know the coal generation still has to go away. And you don't need a long-term price signal for that. And yet we're still not seeing, gentailers or anyone else. And let's face it, your report indicates that the first tier and the second tier gentailers represent 80% of sales. They're still not signing contracts. And I don't want to focus on the gentailers, but I mean, there's a very, very, very clear investment signal, and yet we're still not seeing investment. So I still don't understand.
I think there's probably two key issues that I'd point to. One is it's an incomplete signal. There is no long-term price signal. There's views about what the long-term economics look like, but I suspect the challenge is that there are very clever people, including yourself, David, who do point out that technology will continue to get cheaper over time as we get economies of scale in new products and as we get smarter at doing the things that we've done historically. So I think that those risks are real. The other, I guess, key difference between this and most other markets is it's an essential service. And as a panel, we've spoken a lot with consumers, consumer groups, and there's a fine balance that all public policy needs to strike between the long-term interest of consumers to have a stable, reliable electricity system and that evolution of technology over time and that leading to lower costs. So we think that the balance that we've struck is a very nice way of balancing all of those competing objectives to deliver something that is in the long-term interests of consumers. I think it's a good news story, though, longer term for consumers. If things get cheaper, then that's wonderful. And we would note that the vast majority of energy and capacity that's going through the system at any point in time won't be subject to these types of contracts because they're market-led investments in the front end, and the rolling forward nature of investment means that you're never going to see a majority of the energy and capacity being subject to these types of contracts. So again, it's trying to work through that balance of what's reasonable, what are the risks that it's reasonable to ask investors to take versus the interests of consumers in having a reliable, low-cost energy system longer term.
Yeah. Look, my idea is I appreciate that the panel has consulted extremely deeply and represents so much knowledge. I'm almost embarrassed to be asking questions, but we do our own price forecasting. I must say I see a two-tier market, a market where there's too much wind and solar and the price is zero for long terms. And, at the moment, like utility solar, it's hard to understand why anyone would invest in that. But leaving that aside, I guess, and the other side of part that has missing money is, of course, the stuff that's needed for those occasional wind and solar droughts, and that's the firming contract. That is essentially going to be some kind of capacity contract, isn't it? Because that power has to be there when it's really needed, and it's not going to be operated all the time. So that's a kind of reserve capacity, similar to what existing mechanisms that AEMO already has, like RERT and stuff like that, but just replaced with a better and more formal kind of thing.
So David, Phil here. I think I'd separate out two services. So the firming service that we describe is something that you see in market, and you're right. The natural contracts, the ones we have today to support that, would be a cap contract. And that cap contract would support revenue sufficiency for entry for the sorts of projects that can provide longer duration energy in those circumstances. We also do describe an out of market reserves service for those tail events that wouldn't be captured by our reliability standard, but are there when there are really long renewable droughts, and that would sit outside the market, so it's not interfering with the market signal. So that out of market reserves is, if you will, a fourth service that we do canvass in the report.
I've just got two more final little bits and pieces. One's an observation, really, namely that the shaping services, looking today, do we really need that? A new battery's kind of been offered to the market virtually every week, 9-10 gigawatts. Sure, we need more, but there doesn't seem to be any anything wrong with the price signal in that space at the moment, which makes me wonder why that's not a problem and wind and solar still are. But I just wanted to come back to the behind the integration with the behind the meter. Essentially, if you were summing it up for all of those millions of households that have solar on their roof and will likely have vehicle to the grid capabilities at some stage, and also home batteries that they're putting in place at an incredibly rapid rate, what do these reforms mean for them when they're implemented? And a sort of supplementary question is that I think most of these reforms are designed or were originally thought of to be occurring from 2030 onwards. Is it possible some of them may even come in before that?
It's Phil here again. So yes, those reforms, we put a working position of 2030. There is, of course, the IPR rule change that was introduced by the AEMC in December that would be available from 2027 on a voluntary basis. So it's possible for those reforms to happen sooner. Getting to your question about what does it mean for a household, at one level, it doesn't mean anything for the household. The idea here is that the organizations that are aggregating those small-scale resources have an obligation to participate in the market. And that would fall on those organizations. For instance, in my case, my retailer, who manages my battery into the market, they would be obliged to participate in price formation in one of two ways, either by bidding into the dispatch market like generators or batteries do today, or by forming part of the demand forecast by stating their intentions. So that obligation wouldn't fall on the household, it would form on the organization that aggregates those resources into the market.
Got a couple of questions. Just while we're on the subject of transparency, I saw this press release last week. It came from AGL and NG, and they're talking about this virtual storage deal. And it was 5 years. It was a derivative basis thing, but they couldn't say the size of it. They certainly wouldn't going to tell us the price of it, and they couldn't even say which battery it was. It was just part of a portfolio. So it was all sounded incredibly clever and very promising, but basically no transparency. Is that the sort of thing that you want more details of? Or am I just sort of picking on the wrong example here?
It's Tim here, Giles. So no, we don't need participants to disclose kind of things that they're doing amongst themselves. We think that's a great thing about markets is that people are free to contract in whatever way they like. Where we do see a need for some reform is that where we've got these standardized products, we think that that's where the transparency and the liquidity becomes very important. So if we go back to the original NEM design, you had generators, you had retailers, and they were going to manage that spot risk through the use of these financial contracts, these derivative products. The beauty of them being listed on an exchange is that it's anonymized, so it's easier for people to trade. And in addition to that, you get much greater transparency and liquidity. Why is that in the interests of the industry as well as consumers? Well, consumers, it's pretty obvious. If it's transparent and liquid, I know that the price that I'm paying is fair and reasonable. But for producers, for sellers, having liquid, transparent markets means that it's actually easier to manage my position because the frequency, the transparency, the liquidity means that I can make more efficient decisions about managing my risk, but I can also make more efficient long-term investment decisions as well. So it's not that individual participants doing very clever things amongst themselves is not welcome. Absolutely, that's welcome. But to the extent that participants need to manage their risk across their broader portfolio as buyers and sellers, the need to ensure that as a byproduct of that process, we're getting transparency and liquidity, it's in every interest for that.
Can I just ask on that? I mean, because I 100% agree, and if I took nothing away from this other than that transparency and liquidity in all facets make for better markets, and would be in consumers' interests. That's like a motherhood statement that I completely subscribe to, and it's fantastic you're saying that. But are you suggesting that, like, you're not suggesting that OTC market go away and that everything has to be traded through an exchange, which I could support, because if you don't make it that way, people just do OTC deals anyway?
Not at all. And that's why we're going to go through this pilot process for the second half of the year. We really want participants' views about what that looks like. So if the end working of all of this is the continued utilization of the OTC market, but with greater levels of transparency so that people know what liquidity going through that looks like, they know what the prices are quite regularly, and the obligation to participate in those markets is enforced in a sensible, common sense way. I think we're certainly as a panel open to how that is given effect to. We don't want this to be draconian. We don't want this to be unnecessary cost, but we do want the outcomes, and the outcomes are transparency and liquidity. If we can get those things, I think we're onto a winner.
I'd like to sort of put it back onto the demand side again, and I'm very keen to come back to CER before we finish. But just quickly, just about sort of big loads. We've seen this, we're seeing big smelters looking for renewables and storage and thinking about flexibility in loads. We hear a lot of talk about data centers and the impact and possibly even the benefits that they might have. What has your review, how has your review thought about that?
That's really, we spoke to a lot of large users of electricity, as you might expect. And first thing I'd say is they're very varied in how they use electricity and how flexible they can be and want to be. The second thing I'd say is I was surprised at how much demand response, if we're, one of a broader term, is actually happening in the market today, where people are utilizing their flexibility either directly through the WDRM, through their retailers. So there's a fair bit going on. There are two aspects about it here. So if I've got the long-term need for supply. So for the questions like, if I've got a data center I'm coming in, if I've got a smelter that's trying to repower for my next 15 years, how can they think about getting new supply? But I think the ESEM helps there, knowing that the supply is coming in, knowing that it's coming in at a fair price and providing, therefore, access to it. Part of the idea, of course, was to recycle those contracts. That provides longer-term price visibility, which we've had people tell us if they could start to see longer-term price transparency in those derivative contracts, they might start contracting longer themselves too. So that's how the supply for the new plant for new customers might work. The other is demand response, and how might this package help them on demand response. I think there are a bunch of different ways, as I said, that they are enacting that demand response directly through WDRM, some on price pass-through type contracts, some through their retailers. We think that continues. If someone wants to invest in new capabilities to provide demand response, the ESEM would be open to providing that support too. And we heard again, there are some types of big users who would like to make long-term investments into the flexibility of their factory, for want of a better word. And but they face the tenor gap as well. So if they want to make those investments and it can provide competitive, in this case, probably shaping service, the ESEM would be very open to that.
Okay. Let's bring it back down to households again. And the review observes the need, or talks about the need for sort of scheduling or partial scheduling. And this, I guess, the idea here is that people with rooftop solar, and particularly with a battery, become or join a VPP. Maybe someone can just talk about the importance of that, and also just how to get people across the line on that. I mean, it's probably outside the bounds of the LIM review itself, but it just sort of comes back to the fact that sort of customers have probably felt themselves shortchanged every time they've sort of brought in some new technology or done something. What's the panel's thoughts about that?
What we heard from is Paula here. What we heard from our consultation from consumers is most consumers want predictable, stable bills. And we, in the observations section of our report, have said, look, once we've stretched out this liquidity and price transparency, that's some ripe information to have a longer term benchmark of prices that can not only inform retailers in providing longer term contracts, but also for consumers in being able to compare their offers. You may end up having a bunch of consumers who say, look, I've got my solar panel, I've got my battery. This is just for my own use. I don't want to participate in the market. There's no change there. There's no change to consumer choice. You've got that archetype of consumers. That's fine. Then there are other consumers, like a couple of my fellow panel members here, who like to really engage with the market. So through their retailers who have control over their batteries, they engage in the market. And it is those, as Phil had said, those VPPs that are serving customers like Ava and like Phil should participate in the market and either participate through forming part of the bid stack or participate in forming part of the demand forecast. So coming back again to this is no change for consumers or consumer choice. In fact, that longer term price signal will provide information for that bill stability and that one of our consumers.
Paula?
Yes.
Sorry, I can't help but ask, since you're such an expert on networks, and it is fractionally out of scope, and yet it relates, I think, to Giles' question, because households do care about prices. And as we look forward, it seems to me that average throughput for the existing customers, I'm not talking about new installations, is going to fall. The capacity utilization of the net wires and poles is going to fall because of household batteries, because of rooftop solar has been falling. And there's a revenue cap on networks, wires and poles. So it seems that the only way this can work is by fixed charges going up, or is some more fundamental rethink required? I'm sure you've thought about this. I just wondered what conclusions, if any, you've come to about how it's going to look going forward.
Yeah, we provide some observations in our report. One of the things we set out with at the beginning was to say we're not going to delve into areas where the other market bodies are conducting their reviews, and we know that the AMC is conducting their pricing reviews. So we do provide some observations for them with respect to network tariff reform. And one of them is, as you say, moving away from that time of use, more towards a larger fixed component of their network charges, but also for those customers like my friend Phil here, to move towards dynamic network prices.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask the question now, Phil or perhaps Ava. If you want to play in the market, what do you want to be able to do, and what do you want to see?
So I think, we won't disclose who we're with, but Phil and I have this very enjoyable dialogue every day about who's made or lost money overnight on that trading their solar battery system. And I think some of the elements of that we value is that because we do have the capability and interest in engaging, that option is available to us, and we take some risk in doing so. And that's great. If people want to do that, that's fantastic. But at the same time, and as Paul was speaking to, we're also acknowledging that most people probably aren't interested in that. And Tim's pointing to himself. And they would actually prefer something that's much simpler, doesn't require them to check apps every day or every hour, and can just carry on with the rest of their lives. And so you'll see in that report, in the observations, we talk about inner and outer segments of the retail market. And we're feeding that thinking into the pricing review for how they can shape some of the outcomes of that work.
It's great to be able to participate in the market. But the way I do that can't come at the expense of other customers. It's important, a couple of things. One, that I do participate in price formation, because that makes it more efficient for other customers. And the other is that the network tariffs provide good signals, because my battery optimizes not just for the wholesale market, it optimizes across network and wholesale tariffs. And it shouldn't be the case that I take advantage of network costs, reduce my network costs at the expense of other customers. that signal should be the right signal for me to optimize both the network and the wholesale system. And that's why dynamic network tariffs are important there too.
And which of you two is actually sort of making the most money? And is it because one of you has a bigger battery or one of you has a better plan?
I think I might have the bigger battery. I've got 20 kilowatt hours.
Can I just come back, to the bigger question of these contracts that are going to be offered? What are the next steps then? When can we expect to see some of these contracts actually being offered out into the market? And how will the quantities actually be decided if these forms of contracts are actually, settled, which it seems to me they're a long way from just at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great segue into what our plans are for the rest of the year. So the draft report's out now, and we encourage everyone to review it and make a submission. And then what we're going to do is spend the rest of the year putting meat on the bones of some of those key recommendations. And the one there in particular is piloting a process to determine these core set of standardized derivative contracts that are at the heart of our reforms. As we've spoken, they're going to form the basis of the ESEM mechanism. They form the basis of the market making obligation. Over time, you can see them playing roles in the retail elements of the rules, in the DMO methodology. They're really at the crux of everything we're trying to achieve here. And so we want to pilot that industry-led process throughout the rest of the year to come up with those set of contracts that meet those criteria that Tim outlined earlier. With respect to setting the quantities, a lot of the heavy lifting has been done in the NEO itself. So the NEO obviously, it has already got elements of meeting the reliability standard, but last year there was also the insertion of the emissions reduction objectives into the NEO. And so in terms of setting the quantities, it's obviously meeting the reliability standard, but also working towards meeting those emissions and renewable energy targets that governments have set.
That's really very important. I think that finally putting emissions and the climate into the NEO. So who gets to decide? What's the process then? Who gets to decide exactly what these things look like? Is this, do you put forward more proposals which then get approved by the ministerial meeting? I mean, where are we going to land? Because ultimately it's going to be reasonably contested because people will agree with the process, people will agree with where you're heading, the fine details of what's going to count, and everyone's going to have a vested interest and a say in that.
So it's Tim here. So I think for the next few months, we'll continue to go through the very detailed consultation process. To Ava and Phil's point, we're going to run a pilot process of what we've proposed that would be stood up as a permanent feature of the market, which is an AER convened process to define what those contracts look like. Those standard contracts across the three: bulk energy, shaping and firming, would then be subject to the MMO and utilised under the long-term mechanism. We are aware participants will have different views, but we're also aware that there is a lot of commonality because of the lack of any divergence of views about the need for bulk energy shaping and firming. So we're in a world now where all investors, consumers, everyone is aware of the reality of the firmed renewable system. Now it's a case of coming together and pragmatically working through what those contracts will look like. And again, we're very lucky. There's been so much innovation that's been done in the OTC market. We don't think we really have to invent much at all. We need to utilize that thinking that's been done and bring it into the light, so to speak, so that it can be used for those two purposes. So I think you're right, Giles, to note that the risks to this are a lack of participants being on the buy and the sell side to come together and reach agreement. We've been very heartened by the fact that everybody has approached this task with a real degree of pragmatism and been willing to compromise because they know the urgency of the task at hand. And so I'm pretty optimistic that by the end of the year, we'll have a fairly good working model that we'll be able to put in front of ministers and say, ministers, we think this has broad support and therefore it's worth considering.
Well, I'm not too sure if David's got any more questions, but David,
I'll have questions till they're put in.
course you will.
till they're putting me in the crematorium. But and then I'll be asking how hot.
Outside this process, outside this podcast as well. So, David,
and if I had one tiny trivial but nonetheless important suggestion when you're talking to the broader audience, there's more acronyms come up in this discussion and in the report than you'll find in the average Army drill sessions. So, spelling out what the acronyms are pretty regularly, I think will be helpful to the wider market. Cheers.
One last thing then on that acronym point, David, is that we are aware that the Electricity Services Entry Mechanism, or the ESEM, is the least marketable name that anyone has ever come up with for a policy mechanism. So we do welcome feedback on whether there is a more appropriate name and a better acronym as well.
Yeah, look, it's like the energy efficiency lobby. I mean, they've got such a good sort of idea, and it's never sort of taken hold, and partly because it's too long for headlines. It's just not short, sharp, and whatever. I mean, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but anyway. Look, thank you very much, everyone. Tim, Paula, Ava, and Phil. Sounds like title of a sitcom, but it's been fascinating talking to you all, and we really appreciate the time that you spent with us today, but also the effort that you've actually put into your work over the last 6 months. And you're going to be even busier, I'm guessing, in the next 6 months. So thank you, and congratulations.
It's no secret the energy and renewable infrastructure sector can do better. That's why at Rayo we're leaving a legacy of accessible, affordable and sustainable energy solutions that benefit everyone. Rayo's highly experienced team work to empower their clients through choice and certainty, delivering world-leading, successful energy infrastructure projects. From project development, engineering, construction, commissioning and maintenance, choose the next generation of infrastructure delivery with Rayo. Let's shape a better tomorrow together. Visit rayo.au.
And that was Tim Nelson and crew, Paula Conboy, Ava Hancock, Phil Hershorn from the Nelson Review panel. David, you gave them a thorough questioning there. I thought it was really interesting to, from your point of view, because I think a lot of people in the market will be asking those very same questions. Were you satisfied with the responses?
Look, I think the panel has a very deep knowledge of what the issues were. Tim Nelson certainly worked in the market, obviously, for a very long time and knows what's going on. I think sometimes it might help to actually have input from someone who actually writes these contracts on and trades in the market regularly. Sometimes the subtleties of having worked in an investment bank, you could sit right next to the trader and still not exactly understand how it is that they do their job. Nevertheless, there's a lot of feedback that, as they said, the consensus of what they've come up with broadly reflects the consensus of the inputs to the inquiry, and so what else is, we'll just watch the space.
Yeah, I guess we've just got to wait and see how the details come out, because the devil will be in the detail, as a few people I think have said. So good luck with it. But look, it's a thorough piece of work. They've made the call not to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep the baby, keep the bathwater, or maybe change the bathwater. I think that's the problem.
Let's hope it ends up different to the wool price support scheme, but I'm sure it will.
Look, I'm sure it will. Anyway, look, we're really very thankful to have them on. It's been a busy week. Before you get on, you've got a couple of things that you want to talk about, but I also want to mention there was a report released by Mark Patterson, formerly of CSIRO, on behalf of CSIRO and the Australian Energy Market Operator. Quite an important work on CER and the managing of that. The point basically being made that Australia leads the world on rooftop solar uptake, etc., but is pretty slow, pretty behind the scenes compared to UK and other places on how to manage it. So it's all about the idea of creating a distributed system operator, just to add to the complexity and yet another acronym. But that's going to be, the people who are proposing this see this as quite transformation of a way that consumer energy resources are treated, and that's going to be quite important as we add more solar, more batteries, and more EVs. So there you go, David. It's a shame that it was released on the same day as the NEM review, but we got around to it eventually. But what's on your mind?
Well, speaking as a EV owner and a battery owner and a solar panel long time owner with more there, I just want to be left alone. I don't need a new system operator. I don't need all this stuff. But anyway, everyone's...
That's true, though, isn't it? It is true. Everyone wants to be left alone, but the trouble is the market operator's not happy with that.
The thing, I just quickly wanted to mention two things. We saw last week AGL's, that the battery cost had come down very substantially for a very large 2,000 megawatt hour battery. And, subsequent comments indicated that, in fact, that's not the end of the matter. The costs are still coming down, partly, I think, due to the same sort of thing that happened in solar, just oversupply. But the fundamental drivers of why costs are coming down are quite interesting. The first thing is that cell energy density is increasing. They seem to have found a way to have made cells bigger, which, of course, means you can put more chemicals inside them without suffering the heat effects that used to make the performance of large cells bad. Like when you've got a car, the individual cells in it are quite small, and that's because you often power those cells quite hard and draw on them quite hard when you press the accelerator. But I think in stationary energy, you don't need to do that. You're using these cells at a lot less of their theoretical, and so that lets you make bigger cells, and that means you can get more. And so also, as well as making the cells bigger, you're actually able to get more energy into the cell, and so I think they describe it as watt hours per litre of capacity has gone up about 10% this year, and then this year,
extraordinary,
this year. And then the component, and this has all been driven, I think, largely out of China. And then the number of components that you need to add on with your cells in a container, I was reading on Energy Storage News, has come down from about 30,000 to about 18,000, so halving of the components. So those two things mean that I was reading Marek Cubic, you can buy a container for without any cells in it for $65,000 US. And as you move the storage up from what was at the beginning of this year, 3 megawatt hours in a container, to what it currently is, somewhere probably 6 is a good number. The number of containers that you need has gone down, from 160 to under 100, and maybe even a bit less for a 500 megawatt hour project. And that means even before you consider the cell cost, just the containers themselves have dropped your price by about $10 or $15 a megawatt hour. Then, of course, the cells themselves have got way cheaper, and all the non-container costs, you only have to connect up half as many containers once you've got them on the site. You need less concrete. The less concrete you use, the lower your costs will be. Concrete operators are buggers for charging for stuff. The less land you need, and so on and so forth. So, you're getting to the point where I think that the AGL project was, what was it, for 800 million for 2,000 megawatt hours?
Yes, 800 million for 2,000 megawatt hours compared to 750 million for 1,000 megawatt hours announced 2 years earlier.
Yes, and so I reckon you could put it, and that's for a 4-hour battery effectively. I reckon you could go to an 8-hour battery for less than double that price, And so you sort of compare that with your Snowy 2, and the round-trip efficiency seems to have gone up. They're talking in the ads, I don't know how true it is, about round-trip efficiencies of like 96%. Well, compare that with Snowy 2 at 75%. So there's still a role, I suppose. And that's the other thing about long duration, why I hate that term. You get long duration because you sacrifice power. Right, the reason why long duration is cheap is because you can generate less megawatts at a given point in time from a given amount of storage. When people talk about long duration, what we really want is a given amount of energy that can be delivered, and that's the way to think about it. And so, as we discussed in the Nielsen review, thinking about being able to generate continuously up to some threshold, like the cumulative price threshold, if that still exists in the future, is a good way to go. Meanwhile, transmission costs are still going up, with the latest indicator being the little bump in Irana, isn't it, Giles?
Well, it is. I mean, it's actually just an incremental bump from what we actually previously known, but I mean, it's significant in the sense that it's sort of, probably 7 times now what it was advertised at when the whole process was started, but we've kind of seen that in every major project. We've seen that in Project Energy Connect. We've seen that in Copperstring. We've seen that in VNI West. We've seen that in HumeLink. We've already seen it partially and probably see it more in Marinus, which was sort of controversially approved this week by government still in caretaker mode, and that sort of caused a few ructions.
I'm hopeful, Giles, that once the transmission starts, we'll actually find ways to start getting the cost down again. It's no doubt it's going up, but I'm hoping we can start moving costs down once we get into production and the people, the engineers, find ways to do it, and maybe hopefully we can get a few more people in who are actually good at that stuff, so keep the labour costs under control, eh?
Absolutely. And look, about the only other thing I've got to mention, I did want to mention the deal struck by Ampere Australia, which is now led by Alex Wanhouse, who's been on this podcast several times. That was a First Nations equity deal, the first one that was done without sort of native title or another sort of legal right being done. So that was really quite innovative and quite interesting. So I do hope people take notice of that. And look, just as a record, Diggers and Dealers is also always an interesting thing. They had as their theme uranium mining or uranium or nuclear power, which was a bit strange because I don't know whether off-grid mines are going to be thinking about nuclear, but one of them's got to 90% renewables. The biggest gold mine in Australia, well, one of the biggest gold mines in Australia, the newest gold mine in Australia, Bellevue, and the first it claims to be to net zero. So who knew they could do that?
Be interesting to hear what the Skimpy's opinion on that is out at the Diggers and Mines. Yeah.
Oh, I was hoping you weren't going to say that. I think I don't think they're there anymore, David. I think that's a little bit old school and gone the way of history. So
I never went to a Diggers and whatever, but I sat next to a lot of people that did. It was very interesting.
Well, David, it's an unexpected ending to the Energy Insiders podcast. Thanks to Tim Nelson and his team, Paul Conboy, Ava Hancock and Phil Hershon for joining us and spending their time. It was quite interesting and just really quite valuable. Thanks to you, David. And of course, thanks to our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. And you have something else to say.
Oh, well, I just think it's worth keeping. I'm always reading Doug Lewin stuff about Texas these days because the growth and demand there is just sensational. I hope we're going to be able to talk a little bit more about data centres on this podcast, and see whether Australia is going to actually have a place in data centres going forward, a meaningful place. But let's...
and where they put them.
Where they put them, yes, indeed.
Okay, terrific. Well, I think I thanked everyone. I thank everyone again. Nelson Review, our sponsors, and everyone listening onto this podcast. And we'll be back with another episode of Energy Insiders, probably this time next week. Bye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solid design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.